The Frumentarii are abolished! Their time is over! The network endures in shadow. Behold the imperial splendor.
Magnificent. The scale is overwhelming.
Note their wonder. Record it.
Such detail in the stonework.
Frumentarii, what do these maps tell us?
Sire, the routes are clear but guarded.
Then we must be swift and silent.
Understood, we'll deploy at once. Welcome, envoys. Your presence honors our halls.
We are grateful for this audience. May our talks yield prosperity.
Indeed, our eyes are upon you.
The silence in the wheat. Once, before the world was measured in miles and bound by the cold iron of the legions, there was a silence that stretched across the hills of Latium. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of an indomitable hunger. Rome, that great marble beast, did not begin its reign with a crown of gold, but with a handful of grain. To understand the shadow that would eventually darken every corner of the known world, one must first understand the wheat. One must understand the gold of the fields that fed the iron of the swords. In the earliest days of the empire, when the sun rose over a city that believed itself eternal, the greatest threat was not a barbarian's axe or a king's pride. It was the empty belly. A hungry legion is a ghost, a hungry city is a riot. And so, the emperors, those gods in mortal skin, needed men who could move through the veins of the world. They needed the Frumentarii. They began not as assassins, not as the dreaded whispers in the dark, but as simple men of logistics. They were the grain collectors. Their hands were stained with the dust of the silos, not the blood of the Senate. They were chosen from the ranks of the legions, men who knew the roads, men who could count the sacks of wheat in a province and ensure the supply reached the frontier. They were the couriers of the harvest, the shepherds of the empire's lifeblood. But history is a cruel gardener. It takes a humble seed and waters it with the necessities of power until it grows into a strangling vine. The Frumentarii, traveling from the scorching sands of Egypt to the rain-drenched forests of Germania, saw things. They saw the way a governor looked at his local treasury. They heard the way a merchant whispered of a new, rival god in the back streets of Ephesus. They felt the rhythm of the provinces, the subtle shifts in the air that signaled a coming storm of rebellion. They had the one thing more valuable than gold, more lethal than steel: mobility. While a general was bound to his camp and a senator to his villa, the Frumentarius was free. He was the shadow on the dusty road, the stranger in the tavern, the man with the wax tablet who seemed to be counting grain but was, in truth, counting heartbeats. Imagine a man, his cloak heavy with the grime of 1,000 miles, standing at the edge of a golden field in Sicily. To the farmers, he is a bureaucrat, a necessary nuisance. He checks the quality of the ear. He argues over the weight of the bushel. But as he speaks, his eyes are not on the wheat. They are on the faces of the men. He listens to the silence between their words. He notices the missing brother, the sharpened tool that looks too much like a spear, the sudden hush when he approaches. He is the Grain Man, a title so mundane it was the perfect mask. As the decades turned like the heavy stones of a mill, the emperors realized that a man who could find grain could also find a traitor. Domitian, whose mind was a labyrinth of suspicion, looked at these humble couriers and saw a weapon. Why send an army to crush a spark when a single man could blow it out? The Frumentarii were moved from the granaries to the Castra Peregrina, the camp of the strangers on the Caelian Hill. Here, in the heart of Rome, the logistics of bread became the logistics of fear. They were no longer just soldiers. They were the eyes of the empire. They were given the tessera, the token of passage that opened any gate and commanded any official. They became the thread that bound the distant edges of the world to the emperor's hand. If a fire started in a distant mountain village, the emperor knew of the smoke before the local governor had even smelled it. The transition was subtle, like the creeping of a shadow across a sundial. First, they were asked to carry letters. Then, they were asked to carry secrets. Then they were asked to carry the emperor's justice. The hand that once weighed grain now weighed the worth of a man's life. In this poetic dance of power, the Roman road was their stage. Every milestone was a witness to their passage. They moved in the open, yet they were unseen. They were the commoners of the military, yet they held the power of kings. They were the Frumentarii, the humble servants of the stomach, who became the masters of the soul. The world of the Roman was a world of public ritual, of loud proclamations and massive monuments. But beneath that world, the Frumentarii were building a second empire, a hidden geography of information. They mapped the whispers of the markets and the silences of the villas. They understood that the strongest walls are not made of stone, but of the fear of being watched. When the sun set over the forum and the long shadows of the columns reached out like fingers, the people of Rome would speak of the wheat men with a new kind of reverence. Not the reverence of gratitude, but the cold, shivering reverence of a man who knows that even his dreams might be reported to the palace. This was the dawn of the secret age. This was the moment the Republic's light finally flickered out, replaced by the flickering torches of the imperial shadow, and it all began with a simple grain of wheat falling into the palm of a man who had learned how to listen to the dark. The camp of strangers. To know the shadow, one must walk the hill where it is cast. In the eternal city of Rome, where 7 hills rise like the knuckles of a sleeping giant, the Caelian Hill stood as a place of strange, silent gravity. Here, the air felt different. It did not carry the salt of the Tiber or the heavy incense of the Forum's temples. It smelled of old dust, dried ink, and the cold metallic tang of iron that had traveled too far. This was the site of the Castra Peregrina, the camp of the strangers. Why call a camp foreign in the very heart of the capital? Because the men who lived within these walls were ghosts in their own land. They were soldiers, yes, but they were soldiers without a home. They had been plucked from the Danubian frontiers, the Syrian deserts, and the misty edges of Britannia. They were the Peregrini, the outsiders, and in their foreignness lay their greatest utility to the emperor. A man with no local ties is a man who can watch his neighbor without the burden of love. The Castra Peregrina was not a place of grand parades or golden eagles. It was a labyrinth of stone and suspicion. Behind its gates, the logistics of the wheat, the frumentum, slowly curdled into the logistics of the soul. The men who entered as simple grain collectors left as something else entirely. They were the emperor's personal weave of nerves, extending from the marble floors of the Palatine to the furthest mud-caked outpost of the world. Imagine the transition of a young legionary, born in the sun-drenched valleys of Spain. For years he had known the honest brutality of the front lines. He knew the weight of the pilum and the sound of a shield wall under pressure. But then a letter arrives. He is chosen. He is sent to Rome. He does not go to the barracks of the Praetorians, the gilded giants who guard the emperor's body. No, he is sent to the Caelian. He is given a wax tablet and a cloak that bears no insignia. He is told that his war is no longer fought with a gladius, but with an ear pressed against a wall. In the poetic silence of the camp, these men were forged into the Frumentarii. They were the strangers who knew everything. They lived in a state of permanent transit, their boots always caked with the soil of a dozen different provinces. In the streets of Rome, they were the invisible men. They wore the common tunic of the merchant, or the rough wool of the traveler. They sat in the wine shops of the Subura, listening to the grumbles of the plebeians. They stood in the shadows of the great baths, watching the way a senator leaned toward his companion. They were the eyes of the emperor, but they were also his hands. The camp of strangers was a hub of a hidden geography. Every day couriers arrived, their horses lathered in sweat, carrying the breath of the empire. A revolt in Judea, a failed harvest in Africa, a whisper of a conspiracy in the Senate. All of it flowed into the Castra Peregrina. Here, the information was weighed like grain. What was useful was kept. What was chaff was burned. The Frumentarii became the masters of the officium, the office of the secret. They learned the art of the cipher, the mathematics of treason, and the patience of the hunter. The Emperor Hadrian, a man whose mind was as restless as the wind, loved these men. He was a traveler himself, a builder of walls and a seeker of knowledge. He understood that an empire of such vast scale could not be ruled by force alone. It must be ruled by awareness. Under his reign, the Castra Peregrina became the true center of Roman power. The Senate might deliberate, and the generals might march, but it was the Frumentarii and the Caelian who decided whose name would be whispered to the emperor at midnight. There is a fairy tale quality to their power, but it is a dark tale told in a voice that never rises above a breath. It is the story of the man who is everywhere and nowhere. The people of Rome began to feel the weight of these strangers. They noticed that the man who had been asking about the price of corn was the same man who was present when the tax collector arrived with an arrest warrant. They noticed that the traveler who shared their bread at the inn was the same one who disappeared just before the secret police raided the local villa. The Castra Peregrina was the heart of this paranoia. It was a fortress built not to keep an enemy out, but to keep the truth in. Inside its walls, the Frumentarii practiced the dark alchemy of the state. They learned that a single word placed in the right ear could topple a dynasty. They learned that the silence of a grave is the ultimate security for a throne. As the sun sets over the Caelian Hill, the shadows of the Castra Peregrina stretch long and thin, like fingers reaching for the throat of the city. The men within do not look at the stars, they look at the maps. They trace the roads that they have built, the roads that they have turned into veins of information. They are the strangers who have made Rome their own, and in doing so, they have ensured that no one in Rome is ever truly alone. The stones of the camp are cold, but they are heavy with the secrets of 1,000 lives. Each block of travertine was a witness to a transformation, from soldier to spy, from protector to predator. The Castra Peregrina was the cradle of the Secret Service, a place where the honor of the Legion was traded for the efficiency of the Shadow. And as the night deepens, the grain men prepare to leave their gates once more, moving out into the sleeping world to ensure that the Emperor's peace remains as cold and unbroken as the marble of his tomb. The knife in the dark, in the long blood-stained tapestry of Rome, there comes a moment when the needle stops sewing the cloth of civilization and begins to pierce the skin of its own children. The transition was not a sudden thunderclap, but a slow rhythmic drip of water onto a stone, wearing away the last vestiges of the Republic's honor until only the cold, hard bone of tyranny remained. The Frumentarii, those humble men of the wheat, had learned the geography of the world. Now they were tasked with learning the geography of the human heart, specifically how to stop it from beating. There is a dark poetry in the way power consumes itself. The emperor, sitting upon a throne of ivory and gold, is a god to the masses, but to himself, he is a man surrounded by ghosts. Every rustle of a curtain, every footfall in a corridor, every silence that lasts a second too long is a potential dagger. To combat the ghosts, the emperor needed his own spirits, men who could walk through walls, men who could strike from the void. And so the grain men laid down their measuring rods and took up the sika, the curved dagger of the assassin. Imagine a city at night, the great Subura cloaked in a mist that rises from the sewer grates like the breath of the underworld. In a small tavern, a senator whispers to a merchant about the rising taxes and the emperor's increasing madness. It is a small thing, a spark of dissent in a sea of loyalty. But in the corner, hooded and silent, sits a man who looks like a simple courier. He is drinking cheap wine, his eyes fixed on the table. But his ears are wide, drinking in every vibration of the senator's voice. He is a Frumentarii, and for him, this tavern is not a place of rest, but a battlefield. He does not strike there. He is patient, like the spider in the web. He follows the senator through the winding alleys, moving with the fluidity of a shadow. He knows the rhythm of the city's watchmen. He knows which streets are dead ends and which houses have loose tiles. When the moment comes, it is not a spectacle. There is no trial, no public execution, no grand speech. There is only a hand over a mouth, a sharp cold sting between the ribs, and a body left in the darkness to be found by the morning sun. The world called it the Emperor's justice, but the Frumentarii knew it was something else. It was the silent harvest, As the reigns of emperors like Domitian and Commodus descended into the depths of paranoia, the Frumentarii became the architects of a hidden terror. They were the ones who turned the dinner party into a minefield. A nobleman would host a feast filled with music and the scent of roasted meat, only to notice a guest he did not recognize, a man with the quiet, watchful eyes of a hawk. The music would falter, the laughter would dry up, and the wine would turn to vinegar in their mouths. That stranger was the messenger of the end. He was the eye that never blinked. The Frumentarii were unique because they were the first to understand that the greatest weapon of the state is not the sword, but the uncertainty. If you execute a man in the forum, you create a martyr. If a man simply disappears on his way to the baths, you create a nightmare. The Frumentarii made the world unpredictable. They broke the trust between friends, between brothers, between the people and their past. They ensured that the only safe place for a Roman was in the shadow of absolute obedience. But do not think of them as mindless brutes. They were scholars of the kill. In the Castra Peregrina, they studied the anatomy of fear. They learned which poisons left no trace in the blood, which accidents could be staged to look like a slip of the foot or a sudden fever. They became masters of the untraceable. They were the men who could enter a locked villa, deliver the emperor's invitation to suicide, and leave before the household had even realized their master was dead. They were the ghosts that guarded the god. The poet Juvenal once asked, "Who will guard the guards themselves?" But for the Frumentarii, the question was different. Who can hide from the ones who know where the bread is kept? They had the logistical power to track a man across continents. A fugitive could flee to the mountains of Armenia or the shores of the Atlantic, but he would still need to eat. He would still need to cross a bridge or buy a horse. And at every grain silo, at every crossroads, at every port, there was a man with a wax tablet, watching. The Frumentarii had turned the very infrastructure of the empire into a trap. In this cinematic nightmare, the Roman road becomes a vein of poison. Each milestone is a silent sentinel. The golden milestones of Rome, which once signaled the reach of civilization, now signaled the reach of the secret knife. The Frumentarii had become the reapers in the fields. They no longer collected the grain to feed the city. They cut down the tall stalks that dared to grow higher than the rest. They were the first truly professional secret service, a blueprint for every shadow organization that would follow in the millennia to come. They understood that information is the precursor to execution. They mapped the social networks of the empire, identifying the nodes of influence and severing them with surgical precision. They were the immune system of the autocracy, attacking any cell that appeared foreign to the body of the emperor's will. As the 3rd century approached, the line between the soldier and the spy vanished entirely. The Frumentarii were now the dominant force within the military hierarchy, often holding more power than the legates they supposedly served. They were the princes of the strangers, and their word was law. Even the Praetorian Guard, the elite protectors of the palace, looked at the Frumentarii with a mix of respect and terror. The Praetorians were the shield, but the Frumentarii were the invisible, poisoned dart. Imagine the psychological toll on a civilization that had once prided itself on the rule of law. The Roman citizen, once a man of rights and dignity, became a man of whispers. The public spaces, the theaters, the markets, the temples, became places of performance where everyone wore a mask of loyalty, fearing that the person standing next to them was a wheat man in disguise. This was the transformation of Rome, from a community into a collection of isolated, terrified souls, held together only by the gravity of the Secret Service. The Frumentarii had succeeded in their darkest mission. They had made the emperor omnipresent. By being everywhere, they made it feel as though the emperor was watching every private moment, hearing every stray thought. They were the materialization of imperial paranoia, a shadow that never left the heels of the Roman people. And in the silence of the night, as the torches flickered out and the city grew cold, the only sound was the soft rhythmic step of the stranger on the road, the man who came to count the grain, but stayed to harvest the lives. The knife in the dark was not just a tool, it was a philosophy. It was the realization that an empire of millions could be controlled by a few thousand men, provided those men had the courage to be monsters and the patience to be ghosts. The Frumentarii had become the ultimate expression of Rome's dark side, the poetic, cinematic horror of a civilization that had traded its soul for the security of a secret police. The web of the spider. To rule an empire is to live in a state of constant, suffocating awareness. In the 2nd century of the Roman era, the world was a vast, sprawling organism, its limbs stretching from the heather-covered hills of Caledonia to the sun-scorched palms of the Euphrates. To the common eye, this was a masterpiece of order, a triumph of stone and law. But to the emperor, it was a terrifyingly quiet house, where every closed door might hide a conspiracy, and every silent province might be sharpening its teeth. This was the era of the great spiders, emperors like Hadrian, who understood that the strength of the throne was not in the thickness of its walls, but in the density of its information. And at the center of this web sat the Frumentarii, the spinners of the secret silk. Imagine the map of the empire not as a series of borders, but as a nervous system. Every road was a nerve, every port was a pulse point, and every grain silo was a memory. The Frumentarii had spent decades mapping the flow of the wheat. Now, they used that same infrastructure to map the flow of thought. They were the first to realize that the empire's greatest achievement, the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, was also its greatest tool of surveillance. The roads were the veins of Rome, and the Frumentarii were the white blood cells, moving through those veins to identify and destroy any infection of dissent before it could spread. The Emperor Hadrian was a man of restless energy, a king who could not remain still while the world whispered behind his back. He spent more time in the provinces than he did in the capital, walking the frontiers, inspecting the walls, and talking to the common soldiers. But behind him, always half a step in the shadow, moved his grain men. They were his secret architects. While Hadrian was building walls of stone to keep the barbarians out, the Frumentarii were building walls of fear to keep the citizens in. They were given the tessera, the ivory or bronze token that signaled the emperor's own authority. With this token, a Frumentarius could demand the fastest horses from any stable, the best room in any inn, and the absolute silence of any official. In the provinces, the arrival of a wheat man was like a sudden frost in summer. A governor in Gaul or a legate in Pannonia would receive the traveler with forced smiles and sweating palms. They knew that this man, who arrived with nothing but a tablet and a tired horse, held their lives in his ink. Was he here to check the accounts of the harvest, or was he here to count the number of times the governor had failed to toast the emperor's health? The Frumentarii had turned the logistical necessity of feeding Rome into a psychological weapon of provincial control. They were the auditors of the soul. The beauty of their web lay in its invisibility. The Roman road was a public space filled with merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers. A Frumentarius moving along these roads was just another traveler. He might dress as a monk of an Eastern cult, a trader in fine oils, or a retired soldier looking for a plot of land. He would sit by the fire in a roadside mansio, listening to the gossip of the mule drivers. He would hear about the local taxes that were too high, the judge who was too easily bribed, or the rebel who was hiding in the hills. By the time he reached the next station, a letter was already being prepared for the Castra Peregrina in Rome. The information was processed with a cold, mechanical efficiency that the world would not see again for nearly 2,000 years. They were the masters of the hidden inventory. They knew who owned the most land in a district, who had the most influence over the local tribes, and who was secretly corresponding with the enemies of the state. They understood that to control a man, you do not need to imprison him. You only need to know his secrets. The Frumentarii were the keepers of the empire's blackmail. They held the keys to 1,000 locked closets, and they used those keys to ensure that the provinces remained as still as a mirror. In the cities of the East, Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, the web was even more complex. These were places of ancient pride and endless intrigue. The Frumentarii moved through the great libraries and the bustling agoras, their ears tuned to the frequency of rebellion. They watched the way the philosophers spoke to their students, looking for the seeds of subversive thought. They understood that an idea can be more dangerous than an army and they were the ones who ensured that dangerous ideas died in the dark. They were the censors of the mind, the guardians of the Emperor's narrative. But the web did not just catch the small flies. It was designed to snare the wolves. High-ranking generals, who might be tempted to use their legions to claim the purple for themselves, found that their own officers were often Frumentarii in disguise. A centurion, who seemed fiercely loyal, might actually be reporting every word spoken in the command tent back to the Caelian Hill. The military hierarchy was hollowed out by suspicion. No man could trust his second-in-command, for the Emperor's eyes were everywhere, even beneath the armor of his bravest soldiers. Hadrian used this network to create a panopticon of the provinces. He wanted a world where the presence of the Emperor was felt in every corner, regardless of where he physically stood. The Frumentarii were the materialization of that desire. They were the ones who turned the vast, disconnected lands of the Empire into a single, synchronized machine of obedience. They were the ones who made sure that the peace of Rome was not a peace of contentment, but a peace of absolute, terrified stillness. As the 2nd century drew to a close, the web had become so dense that it began to stifle the very empire it was meant to protect. The flow of information was so great that it required an army of scribes and analysts to process it. The Castra Peregrina grew in size and influence, becoming a shadow government that operated outside the traditional laws of the Senate. The weak men were now the most powerful bureaucrats in the world, holding the power of life and death over millions, all while maintaining the humble title of grain collectors. Imagine a sunset over the harbor of Ostia. The great ships from Africa are arriving, their hulls heavy with the wheat that will feed the capital. On the docks, among the shouting sailors and the creaking cranes, stands a man with a wax tablet. He is counting the sacks. He looks mundane, a small cog in the great machine of the state. But as he works, he is also watching the faces of the sailors. He is listening to the rumors of a plague in Carthage or a riot in the Nile Delta. He is a spider, feeling the vibrations of the silk. He is the reason the Emperor sleeps, and the reason everyone else stays awake. This was the web of the spider, a masterpiece of cinematic control, a poetic tragedy of a world that had become a prison of its own making. The Frumentarii had taken the gold of the fields and the iron of the roads and woven them into a shroud for the Republic's freedom. They had ensured that the sun never set on the Emperor's gaze, but in doing so, they had ensured that the light of truth would never again reach the hearts of the Roman people. The Empire was safe, but it was silent, and in that silence, the only sound was the scratching of a stylus on a wax tablet, recording the final breaths of a dying liberty. The chamber of echoes. There is a sound that defines the death of a civilization, and it is not the roar of a falling wall or the clash of a barbarian's shield. It is the sound of a door closing, slowly, deliberately, in a room where the light of the sun never reaches. In the heart of the Castra Peregrina, on that silent Caelian Hill, there were rooms that did not appear on any architect's map. These were the chambers of echoes. Here the Frumentarii practiced the most delicate and devastating art of the state, the breaking of the human spirit. For a secret service is not merely a collector of facts, it is a sculptor of reality. They understood that to truly control the world, you must not only know what men do in the dark, but you must own the very darkness itself. Imagine a man, perhaps a poet who wrote a line too sharp, or a merchant who held a letter he should have burned. He is taken in the dead of night, not by the heavy-booted Praetorians, but by two men in plain cloaks who speak in whispers. He is brought to the Caelian. He is not thrown into a dungeon of filth and rats. That is for common criminals. No, he is brought to a room that is unnervingly clean, unnervingly quiet. There is a table, a chair, and a single lamp that flickers with the fat of a sacrifice. This is the stage where the wheat men demonstrate their true harvest. They do not begin with the rack or the iron. They begin with the truth. They tell the man what he ate for breakfast 3 days ago. They tell him the name of the woman he glanced at in the market. They recite the words he whispered to his wife in the privacy of their bed. This is the first movement of the psychological harvest, the total annihilation of privacy. When a man realizes that his most secret moments have been recorded, his soul begins to fray. The Frumentarii knew that fear is not born from the unknown, but from the realization that you are fully known by an enemy who remains a mystery to you. They were the masters of the omniscient gaze, and in these rooms they made the Emperor feel like a god who could see through stone and skin alike. As the hours turn into days, the silence in the Chamber of Echoes becomes a physical weight. The Frumentarii were masters of the slow interrogation. They would leave a man alone for an eternity, letting the silence roar in his ears until he began to talk to the walls. And when they returned, they were not monsters, but friends. They offered a cup of water, a sympathetic ear, a way out of the darkness. This was the good grain technique, the manipulation of hope. They would convince the prisoner that his only salvation lay in betrayal. Tell us of the others, they would whisper, and the sun will shine on you again. In this way, they turned the victim into a weapon, ensuring that even if he left the room alive, he was no longer a man, but a vessel for their influence. But for those who were stubborn, for those who believed that the mind could remain a fortress, the Frumentarii had other, more ancient methods. They were the inheritors of the tortures of the East and the cold efficiencies of the North. They understood the geography of pain, how to apply just enough pressure to the nerves to make the mind scream without killing the body. They used the water of Lethe, a technique of sensory deprivation that made a man forget his own name. They used the iron mirror, where a prisoner was forced to watch his own slow dissolution in a polished surface. This was not the mindless brutality of a common jailer. It was the clinical, poetic application of suffering to extract the essence of a secret. The Castra Peregrina became a factory of broken wills. From its gates, men emerged who would never again speak above a whisper. They were the living echoes, walking warnings to the rest of Rome. The people saw them in the streets, the vacant eyes, the trembling hands, and they understood the message. You do not need to execute everyone if you can make everyone believe that they are already dead. The Frumentarii had turned the Roman mind into a landscape of landmines. Every thought became a danger, every memory a potential treason. This was the true peace of Rome, a peace of the grave enforced by the men who counted the grain. In the later years of the 2nd century, under the reign of Commodus, the madness of the palace flowed directly into the interrogation rooms. The Frumentarii were no longer just searching for rebels. They were searching for ghosts to feed the emperor's paranoia. They began to invent conspiracies where none existed, weaving webs of lies that snared the innocent and the guilty alike. The Chamber of Echoes became a place of creative terror. They would stage trials where the accuser, the judge, and the witness were all Frumentarii in different disguises. They turned the law into a theater of the absurd, where the only reality was the pain of the accused. The psychological impact on the city of Rome was profound. The eye was no longer just a figure of speech. It was a physical presence felt in the pit of the stomach. The Roman citizens began to police themselves. They watched their own tongues, they edited their own letters, they avoided the eyes of strangers. The wheat men had succeeded in making the state internal. They had occupied the territory of the conscience. This was the ultimate victory of a secret service, when the people become their own jailers. The architecture of silence was now the architecture of the Roman soul. Imagine the sunset over the Caelian Hill, the long shadows of the Castra Peregrina reaching out like the fingers of a colossal ghost. Inside, the lamps are being lit. A new guest has arrived. The door closes with that same deliberate sound. Outside, the city of Rome continues its noisy, vibrant life. The chariots race, the actors perform, the wine flows. But beneath the noise, there is a hollow space. Everyone knows about the hill. Everyone knows about the strangers. And in the secret heart of every Roman, there is a small, cold room where they sit in silence, waiting for the knock on the door that never comes, but is always expected. The Frumentarii had turned the empire into a hall of mirrors, where every reflection was a distortion and every truth was a lie. They were the ones who ensured that the emperor was the only source of light, while the rest of the world lived in the flickering shadows of their interrogation rooms. They were the poets of the scream, the architects of the void, And as the night deepens, the echoes of the broken continue to vibrate through the stones of the Caelian, a silent song of a world that has forgotten how to speak the truth. This was the Chamber of Echoes, a cinematic descent into the dark side of power, a poetic exploration of how a civilization loses its mind before it loses its walls. The Frumentarii had taken the gold of the fields and turned it into the lead of the heart. They had ensured that the silence of the wheat was now the silence of the oppressed. And in that silence, the only thing that grew was the fear, thick and choking, like the weeds in a neglected garden, waiting for the final harvest of the Empire's soul. The Shadow Kingmakers. There is a terrifying moment in the life of every empire when the tools of protection become the architects of destruction. It is the moment when the guard realizes that the man he protects is merely a costume, and the power he serves is merely a ghost. In the 3rd century of the Roman era, that realization did not happen in the Senate or on the battlefields of the Rhine. It happened in the quiet, shadowed corridors of the Castra Peregrina. The Frumentarii, those men who had once been humble collectors of wheat, had finally completed their transformation. They were no longer the eyes of the empire. They had become its heart, cold, rhythmic, and absolute. They were the Shadow Kingmakers, the men who sat upon an invisible throne made of secrets, whispers, and the blood of emperors. To understand the scale of this betrayal, one must look at the topography of power in Rome. On the Palatine Hill sat the emperor, surrounded by the gold of the world and the pretense of divinity. But across the valley, on the Caelian Hill, sat the Princeps Peregrinorum, the prince of the strangers. He did not wear the purple, but he held the threads that kept the purple from unraveling. While the emperor gave speeches to the masses, the prince of the strangers read the reports from the frontiers. He knew which general was planning a coup, which senator was hiding a bribe, and which grain ship was carrying a cargo of poison. The information was the currency of the new world, and the Frumentarii were the only ones who knew how to mint it. The transition from servant to master was subtle, a slow erosion of imperial autonomy. It began with the filter of reality. An emperor can only react to what he knows, and by the middle of the 3rd century, the emperors knew only what the Frumentarii allowed them to know. If the wheat men wanted a governor removed, they would manufacture a conspiracy. If they wanted a war to continue, they would hide the reports of peace. They had created a synthetic reality for the throne, a hall of mirrors where the emperor was a prisoner of his own intelligence service. The man who wore the crown was the most powerful man in the world, yet he was the only one who did not know the truth of his own empire. This was the era of the invisible coup. In the past, a coup required an army and a civil war. Now, it only required a single, well-placed whisper. The Frumentarii had mastered the art of political decapitation. They understood that you do not need to kill an emperor to destroy him. You only need to destroy his credibility. They would leak secrets to the public, engineer shortages in the markets, and foster distrust among the Praetorian Guard. By the time the dagger was drawn, the emperor was already a ghost, abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect him. The Frumentarii were the ones who decided when the theater of a reign would end and when the curtain would rise on the next tragedy. Imagine a night on the Palatine, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of the Tiber. The emperor, perhaps a man like Pertinax or Didius Julianus, sits alone in his study. He hears a sound, the soft rhythmic step of a man who does not belong in the palace. It is a Frumentarius. He does not come with an army. He comes with a tablet. He shows the emperor a list of names, men who have already been paid to betray him, gates that have already been unlocked, and a successor who has already been chosen. In that moment, the emperor realizes that he is not a god. He is merely a piece of grain on the threshing floor. The wheat man has come to harvest the crown. The Frumentarii had become a state within a state. They had their own laws, their own courts, and their own treasury. They operated outside the reach of the law, for they were the ones who enforced it. Even the great legates of the legions, men who commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, trembled when a Frumentarius entered their camp. They knew that a single letter from the Caelian Hill could end their careers and their lives. The military hierarchy, the backbone of Rome, had been hollowed out from the inside. The soldiers no longer looked to their generals for leadership. They looked to the shadows, fearing the man who watched from the corner of the tent. This was the poetry of the puppet show. The Roman people still saw the parades, the triumphs, and the grand ceremonies of state. They still saw the emperor as the ultimate authority. But those who were initiated into the secrets of the Caelian knew better. They knew that the empire was now a clockwork machine, and the Frumentarii were the ones who wound the spring. The Secret Service had become the ultimate expression of the dark side of Rome, a civilization that had become so obsessed with security that it had surrendered its will to the monsters it had created to protect it. But power, when it becomes absolute, also becomes brittle. The Frumentarii, in their quest to control everything, had created a world of total instability. Because no emperor could trust them, and because they could trust no emperor, the cycle of assassinations accelerated. The crisis of the 3rd century was not just a crisis of borders and economy. It was a crisis of trust, engineered by the very men who were supposed to be the guardians of the state. The Shadow Kingmakers were burning down the house they lived in, blinded by the brilliance of their own secrets. They had become the reapers of the Republic, cutting down the very foundation of the Roman identity. The corruption was not just political, it was spiritual. The Frumentarii had turned the Roman virtue of gravitas into a mask of deception. They had turned the Roman law into a weapon of convenience. They were the ones who ensured that the true Rome, the Rome of Cato and Cicero, was buried beneath a mountain of lies. They were the architects of a nightmare where the only truth was the knife and the only law was the secret. They had become the invisible lords of the Mediterranean, a dark priesthood of information that worshipped only the continuity of their own power. Imagine the Princeps Peregrinorum standing on the balcony of the Castra Peregrina, looking out over the city as the sun sets. He sees the smoke rising from the altars. He hears the roar of the Colosseum, and he feels the pulse of the millions. He knows that he is the one who keeps it all moving. He is the secret king of Rome. But as he watches, he also sees the cracks in the murmur. He sees the shadows of the barbarians growing longer on the horizon. He realizes that in his quest to control the heart of the empire, he has forgotten to protect its limbs. The spider has woven a web so beautiful and so complex that it has trapped the spider itself. The Shadow Kingmakers were a cinematic tragedy, a story of a world that traded its soul for the illusion of control. The Frumentarii had taken the grain of the people and turned it into the poison of the throne. They had ensured that the silence of the wheat was now the silence of a dying civilization, a silence broken only by the whispers of the men who would eventually watch the empire burn. Secure in the knowledge that they were the ones who had lit the fuse, the shattered mirror, there is a specific kind of silence that follows the breaking of a long, agonizing fever. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion, the heavy, hollow breath of a world that has survived a nightmare only to realize it has forgotten how to live in the light. By the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was no longer a civilization. It was a vast, scarred body, and the Frumentarii were the infection that had reached the marrow of its bones. The wheat men had grown so large, so bloated with secrets and blood, that they were no longer a tool of the state. They were a parasite that threatened to consume the host. But even the most ancient and resilient demons must eventually face their exorcist. And for the Frumentarii, that exorcist was a man born of the Danubian soil, a soldier with a mind like a cold iron blade. Diocletian. To understand the fall of the Frumentarii, one must first understand the depth of the hatred they had sowed. For 2 centuries they had walked the streets of Rome like ghosts, their presence a constant, vibrating pressure in the back of every citizen's mind. The very word Frumentarius had become a curse, a name whispered in the dark to frighten children, a synonym for betrayal, theft, and the sudden, unexplained disappearance of a father or a brother. They had stolen the trust of the Roman people, and in its place they had planted a crop of absolute, crystalline resentment. The grain they collected was now stained with the tears of 1,000 broken families. The silent harvest had become too loud to ignore. Diocletian was not a man of sentiment, but he was a master of stability. He looked at the Empire and saw a machine that had been shattered by its own secret police. He saw the Shadow Kingmakers of the Castra Peregrina and realized that no emperor could ever truly rule as long as these men held the keys to the invisible throne. The Frumentarii had become a liability, a force so toxic that their mere existence was a spark for rebellion. They were the visible symbol of the old chaos, the messy, paranoid, and unpredictable world of the 3rd century crisis. To build his new, orderly autocracy, Diocletian knew he had to kill the monster he had inherited. He had to shatter the mirror. The end did not come with a battle or a grand execution. It came with an edict, a cold, bureaucratic stroke of the stylus that erased 200 years of terror. In the year 298, Diocletian officially abolished the Frumentarii. The Castra Peregrina, that dark fortress on the Caelian Hill, was stripped of its mystery. The wheat men were told to lay down their tablets and their daggers. To the public, it was a moment of liberation, a cinematic triumph where the sun finally seemed to break through the clouds of the secret state. People danced in the streets of the Subura. They toasted the new era of the great reformer. They believed that the eye had finally been blinded. But Diocletian was a spider of a different kind. He knew that an empire without eyes is a blind beast, waiting to stumble into an abyss. He did not destroy the concept of the Secret Service. He simply changed its mask. He understood that the name Frumentarii was too poisoned to be saved, so he replaced them with something cleaner, something more professional, and infinitely more dangerous. The agentes and Rebus, the general managers. The transition was a masterpiece of poetic deception. Where the Frumentarii had been rugged, unpredictable, and often brutal soldiers, the agentes in Rebus were polished intellectual bureaucrats. They did not dress like simple travelers. They wore the official robes of the imperial administration. They were the couriers of the sacred palace. But beneath the fine linen and the cultured speech, the mission remained identical. They were the new spiders, weaving a web that was even more extensive and more disciplined than the one that had preceded it. They were the Frumentarii 2.0, refined by the cold logic of a new age. Imagine the closing of the Castra Peregrina. The great gates are locked, the archives are burned, and the men who once held the power of life and death are sent back to their legions or allowed to fade into the shadows. The Roman people watched as the old symbols of their fear were dismantled. They saw the grain men vanish from the crossroads and the markets, but they did not see the new men arriving at the provincial courts. They did not see the new scribes who were now recording their words with even greater precision. The mirror had been shattered, but the glass was still there, smaller, sharper, and hidden in every corner of the room. The agentes in Rebus were the ultimate expression of Diocletian's dominate. They were not just spies, they were inspectors, tax collectors, and enforcers of the imperial will. They were the magistri peperum, the masters of the roads. They turned the logistics of the empire into a scientific system of control. If the Frumentarii were a blunt dagger in the dark, the agentes in Rebus were a surgical scalpel. They did not need to break a man's bones to break his spirit. They could do it through the endless, suffocating pressure of the law and the ledger. This was the cinematic tragedy of the Roman Reformation. The people had traded a monster for a machine. They had celebrated the death of the Frumentarii, not realizing that they were merely witnessing the birth of a more permanent and inescapable surveillance state. The eyes of the empire had not been closed. They had simply been given a new set of lenses. The paranoia of the 3rd century had been replaced by the totalizing order of the 4th. The Secret Service had become a permanent organ of the state, a part of the very air that a Roman breathed. The legacy of the Frumentarii, however, remained as a dark stain on the soul of the West. They had set the blueprint for every secret police force that would follow, from the Inquisition to the modern intelligence agencies. They had proved that information is the ultimate weapon of the autocrat, and that a small dedicated group of men can control an entire civilization through the strategic application of fear and uncertainty. They were the first ghosts, and though their name was forgotten, their methods became the grammar of power for the next 2 millennia. In the final cinematic shot of this history, we see the empty corridors of the Caelian Hill. The torches have been extinguished, and the echoes of the Chamber of Echoes have finally faded. But in the distance, we see the silhouettes of the new men, the agentes, moving along the Appian Way. They do not look like killers, they look like clerks. They carry tablets and scrolls. They move with the quiet confidence of those who know that they no longer need to hide. The silent harvest is over, but the empire of the record has begun. The mirror is shattered, but the reflection of the emperor's gaze is everywhere. The fall of the Frumentarii was not an end, but a metamorphosis. It was the moment when the Secret Service stopped being a tool of the army and became the soul of the government. It was the realization that you can kill the man who watches you, but you can never kill the watching itself. The wheat men had returned to the earth, but the seeds they had planted, the seeds of suspicion, of total awareness, and of the state's ownership of the individual, would continue to grow century after century until the very end of time. This was the shattered mirror, a poetic and dark conclusion to the story of the Frumentarii. They were the monsters of the Republic's end, the architects of the Empire's dark middle, and the sacrificial lambs of the new autocracy. They were the eyes that saw too much, the hands that touched too much, and the souls that carried the weight of a world that had forgotten the meaning of freedom. And as the Roman sun sets for the final time on their history, we are left with only the silence of the fields and the cold, unblinking gaze of the machine that took their place. The inheritors of the void, the greatest changes in the history of power, do not arrive with the roar of a revolution or the thunder of a falling city. They arrive with the soft, rhythmic scratching of a stylus across a dry parchment in a room filled with dust and silence. When Diocletian finally cast the Frumentarii into the ash heap of history, he did not kill the monster. He domesticated it. He took the jagged, blood-stained blade of the secret police and polished it until it became a surgical scalpel. Then he placed it in the hands of a man wearing a silk toga. The Frumentarii had been hunters, wild, unpredictable beasts who ran through the streets with daggers drawn and fear as their only currency. Their successors, the agentes in Rebus, the agents in affairs, were architects. They did not just hunt the enemies of the state. They built a labyrinth from which no soul could escape. This was the birth of the bureaucracy of the soul, a transition from the terror of the sword to the absolute suffocating terror of the file. The agentes in Rebus were designed to be an illusion of progress. They were officially titled the couriers of the sacred palace, and to the casual observer, they were merely disciplined civil servants, moving along the vast arterial roads of the empire to deliver imperial mandates and oversee the efficiency of the public post. Cursus publicus. But beneath the fine linen of their administrative robes and their cultured intellectual speech, there beat the heart of a more efficient predator. The Frumentarii had been soldiers, tethered to the messy politics of the legions. The agentes, however, reported directly to the Magister Officiorum, the Master of Offices, the Emperor's most powerful civilian enforcer. Intelligence was no longer a side effect of military logistics. It had become the central nervous system of a new, absolute autocracy. Rome was no longer ruled by the strength of its walls, but by the weight of its archives. The cinematic horror of this new era lay in its cleanliness. In the old days, when a Frumentarius arrived at your door, you knew the nature of the threat. It was a physical, visceral confrontation, a demand for bribes, a brutal interrogation, or a sudden violent arrest. But when an agent in Rebus entered the provincial court, he did not arrive as a killer. He arrived as an auditor. He was there to check the tax records, to inspect the granaries, to verify the loyalty of the local governor. He was polite, he was meticulous, and he was infinitely more lethal. He did not need to break your bones to destroy your life. He only needed to find a single discrepancy in a ledger, a single whisper of dissent in a private letter, or a single lapse in administrative protocol. The Roman people had celebrated the death of the grain men, not realizing that they had merely traded a visible demon for an invisible, all-knowing machine. The most potent weapon of the agentes in Rebus was the road itself. By seizing total control of the cursus publicus, They gained mastery over the flow of time and truth. Every official report from a distant general, every private correspondence between bishops, every record of trade from a harbor master, all of it passed through the hands of the couriers. They were the editors of reality. They did not just transport information, they filtered it, reshaped it, and sometimes manufactured it entirely. By the time a truth reached the emperor's golden table, it had been processed through the cold, synthetic logic of the bureaucracy. The emperor was the head of the state, but the agentes were the eyes through which he saw and the ears through which he heard. They had created a sentinel state where the act of movement itself was a form of surveillance. In this new Roman world, the soul of the citizen became a prison made of ink and paper. The agentes expanded into a vast army of inspectors known as the curiosi, the curious ones. The name was a piece of dark imperial irony. They were curious about everything: the depth of a merchant's purse, the secret prayers of a senator's wife, the private conversations held in the steam of the public baths. This relentless curiosity destroyed the ancient, proud concept of Roman libertas. A citizen was no longer a partner in the state. He was a subject to be recorded, a variable to be managed, and a potential file to be closed. Trust evaporated from the Roman soil, leaving behind only the salt of suspicion. Espionage was no longer a profession. It had become the very atmosphere of the empire. As the sun began to set on the city of Rome and rise over the golden domes of Constantinople, this shadow organization reached its zenith. In the labyrinthine halls of the Byzantine palace, the agentes in Rebus became the grandmasters of a new kind of power. They were the architects of diplomatic terror. When a foreign embassy arrived in the city, it was the couriers who greeted them, guided them, and watched them every second of every day. They did not defeat the enemies of the empire on the battlefield. They defeated them in the shadows by infiltrating their courts, turning brothers against each other, and offering gold and poison in the same ornate cup. The rugged, dusty camp of the Frumentarii was gone, replaced by a world of perfume, high education, and a lethal calculating intelligence that could topple kingdoms with a single whispered lie. Yet, within this system, the dark genetic code of the Frumentarii endured, a ravenous, self-consuming greed. The agentes in Rebus became so powerful that even the emperors who created them began to fear their gaze. The machine of information they had built began to eat its own creator. Reports were falsified to protect the interests of the bureau, loyalties were auctioned to the highest bidder, and the fate of the world was often decided by two clerks whispering in a candlelit archive. Rome was being digested by the very mechanism it had built for its protection. It was the suicide of a civilization by over-documentation. Imagine a final cinematic shot for this chapter. A lone rider galloping across the Appian Way in the dead of night. He wears the official insignia of the agentes, his robes fluttering in the cold wind. He carries a leather pouch containing a single scroll. That scroll is not a letter. It is the death warrant of a dynasty, the end of a religious sect, or the secret history of a betrayal. That rider is the grandson of the Frumentarii, but he is something much more terrifying. He is the ghost in the machine, the face of the absolute state that never sleeps, never forgives, and never forgets. He is the visual proof that you can kill the man who watches you, but you can never kill the watching itself. The language of the shadow's true power does not always speak in the roar of the crowd or the clash of steel. It often speaks in a language that is hidden in plain sight, a code that everyone sees but only the initiated can read. Within the deepest vaults of the Roman secret state, the Frumentarii had developed more than just a network. They had constructed a visual alphabet of fear. For a wheat man, the world was not a collection of marble buildings, crowded markets, and ancient statues. To them, Rome was a vast vibrating map of secret sigils, coded gestures, and lethal geometries carved into the very walls of the city. The language of the shadows was like a storm within a silence, unheard by the masses, but felt in the marrow of every dissident's bones. This was not merely a way to communicate. It was the art of transforming reality itself into a weapon. The operational arsenal of the Frumentarii resembled the laboratory of an alchemist, more than a military camp. Their most basic signa, signs, were woven into the very fabric of daily life. A specific kind of fibula pinned to a traveler's cloak, a particular rhythm of tapping on a tavern table, or the way a signet ring was turned during a conversation. All of these were sentences in the shadow tongue. When two grain men met in a crowded Subura market, they did not need to exchange a single word. A subtle touch of the index finger to the belt of their tunic could mean target, identified, maintain pursuit. A small, jagged mark made with chalk on the doorframe of an inn could be a silent death warrant, informing the agents inside that the guest arriving that night must never see the dawn. These symbols vibrated at a frequency that only the initiated could hear amidst the cacophony of Rome. The heart of this mystery was the Castra Peregrina, the secret language of the travelers. Because the Frumentarii operated across the entire breadth of the empire, they needed a way to verify identity and rank across thousands of miles of hostile or indifferent territory. Their hierarchy was protected by a complex system of body language and rhythmic greetings. A Frumentarius would prove his identity not with a password, but with the precise angle of his shoulders, the specific way he held his gaze, and the deliberate sequence of his movements. It was a dance of recognition that said, "I am a part of the darkness that serves the light." These visual codes were the state's ultimate trap for its own people, for at any moment, the person standing next to you could be communicating your doom to someone across the square without ever opening their mouth. The technical depth of their surveillance reached its peak in the art of cryptography. The famous Roman wax tablets, tabulae, became instruments of supreme deception in the hands of a frumentarius. A message would be carved into the wood of the tablet itself, and then a layer of wax would be poured over it, upon which a mundane, innocent message, perhaps a list of grain prices, or a boring legal contract, would be written. To anyone who intercepted the tablet, it was a piece of useless bureaucracy, but to the recipient, the wax was meant to be melted away, revealing the blood-stained truth hidden in the wood beneath. They also mastered invisible inks, using substances like milk, vinegar, or plant extracts that would only reveal their secrets when exposed to the heat of a flame. This was the trial of information by fire, where the fate of provinces was decided in the flickering light of a candle. The psychological architecture of the Frumentarii was built upon the terror of the mark. They understood that a symbol could inflict more damage than a physical blade. A rumor persisted in the streets of Rome that a small black circle drawn on the wall of a senator's villa at midnight was a sign of total erasure. To the neighbors who saw it the next morning, that circle meant the family inside was already dead in the eyes of the law. Before the sun had even reached its zenith, the villa would be deserted, friends would become strangers, and the family would be buried in a social grave. The mark was more powerful than the execution itself, because it was a brand of the damned. The Frumentarii used symbols to exhume the secrets of the soul and bury them in public shame. Their most strategic use of this visual language was hidden in the millaria, the milestones that lined every road in the empire. To a Frumentarius, every milestone was a databank, a tiny, almost imperceptible notch carved into the moss of a stone could report the movements of local bandits, the rising unrest of a nearby village, or the location of a hidden safe house. An agent galloping past at high speed would glance at these stones and sense the dangers of the road miles before he reached them. This was the ancient world's version of an intelligence grid, where information was stretched over the landscape like a spider's web, and the Frumentarii were the only creatures who could read the vibrations of the strands. In the heart of the Castra Peregrina on the Caelian Hill, there existed a specialized group known as the Masters of the Alphabet. These scribes were the cryptologists of the ancient world, tasked with inventing new signs, refining encryption techniques, and ensuring that the grammar of the shadow remained unbroken. Every time a new emperor took the throne, the codes were refreshed, and the language of the state was rewritten, because every new power required a new mask for its lies, and every new lie required a deeper silence to protect it. They were the men who understood that if you control the language, you control the thoughts of those who speak it, and if you control the silence, You control those who are afraid to speak at all. This shadow language eventually evolved into the cold mathematical codes of the agentes and Rebus. The rugged, symbolic language of the soldier was replaced by the complex, ledger-driven cryptography of the bureaucrat. But the core principle remained. Information is only power as long as it is hidden. The Frumentarii were the first modern organization to discover the psychological weight of the sigil. They understood that a flag or a standard was not just a source of pride, but a mechanism of control. A symbol could be more effective than 1,000 legionaries, provided everyone knew the dark will that stood behind it. Imagine a final cinematic moment. A rainy Roman night, the sound of hooves echoing on the stone pavers. A rider pauses for a second by the base of a statue of Mars. He runs his hand over a specific spot on a cold stone, feeling a small, raised mark of black pitch. This is the lisan uhafi, the hidden tongue, confirming that an assassination has been sanctioned. The rider does not look back. He does not hesitate. He is a wheat man, and he has just read a word from Rome's invisible alphabet. This single frame encapsulates how a civilization is managed, not just by laws, but by the dark language that exists beneath them. The legacy of this silent alphabet did not vanish with the fall of Rome. Its echoes can be found in the symbolism of secret societies, the sigils of medieval knights, and the top-secret classifications of modern intelligence agencies. The mystery of the Masonic sign, the weight of the sealed file, and the terror of the watch list all find their ancestry in the scribes of the Caelian Hill. We still look at a logo, a color, or a sign and feel a flicker of that ancient fear in the back of our minds. The mark is watching. The Labyrinth of the East, the fall of Rome was not a single, shattering blow, but a long, slow dissolution into the fog of history. Yet, as the lights went out into the west, the flame of the secret state was carried eastward to the city of Constantine, where it was refined into something even more intricate, more deceptive, and more enduring. In the east, the legacy of the Frumentarii did not merely survive, it underwent a metamorphosis, shedding its rugged, legionary skin to become the very soul of the Byzantine machine. This was the era of the Labyrinth, a time when the eyes of the empire became so deeply embedded in the walls of the palace that the state and the shadow were finally and irrevocably one. To understand the survival of the Frumentarii's spirit, one must look to the golden domes of Constantinople, where the art of the secret was elevated to a form of religious liturgy. In the east, the agentes in Rebus, the direct inheritors of the Frumentarii's dark craft, evolved into a class of men who were as much courtiers as they were spies. They were the magistry, the masters of the record, the keepers of the invisible ledger. The rugged paths of the Danubian frontier were replaced by the echoing marble corridors of the great palace. Here, the cinematic terror of the Secret Service took on a new, more polished aesthetic. It was no longer about the sudden strike in the Subura. It was about the slow, agonizing poison of a whispered rumor in the Empress's ear. The wheat men had become the men of silk, but their harvest was still the same: the lives, the loyalties, and the secrets of men. The Byzantine Secret Service became a masterpiece of total awareness. They understood that in a city built on the intersection of 3 continents, information was the only currency that never lost its value. The agentes expanded their reach until they were no longer just a department of the government. They were the government. They controlled the gates, the ports, the markets, and the altars. Every foreign dignitary who entered the city was assigned a guide, a polite, cultured man who spoke 5 languages and knew the history of every barbarian tribe. This guide was, of course, a courier, a man whose only job was to record every word, every glance, and every weakness of the visitor. The Empire did not need to fight wars when it could simply map the minds of its enemies and turn them against themselves. This was the diplomatic terror of the East. The Frumentarii had used fear as a blunt instrument. The Byzantines used it as a psychological landscape. When a Viking mercenary or a Persian envoy walked through the streets of Constantinople, they were overwhelmed by a carefully choreographed display of divine power and invisible watching. They saw the golden automatons, the rising thrones, and the glittering icons, but they did not see the men behind the curtains, recording their every reaction. The Secret Service had realized that the most effective way to control a man is to make him believe that you already know his every thought. They turned the city itself into a giant, golden panopticon. The Curiosi, those descendants of the Frumentarii who specialized in domestic surveillance, became the architects of a society where privacy was a forgotten relic of the past. In the East, the state did not just watch for treason, it watched for heresy. The Secret Service became the enforcer of religious orthodoxy, bridging the gap between the palace and the church. A whisper against the emperor was a whisper against God, and the Meraclar, the curious ones, were there to hear it in every cathedral, every tavern, and every monastery. They were the first to understand that to control a civilization, you must control its faith. They were the eyes of the sacred, and their gaze reached into the very souls of the people. The cinematic tragedy of the Byzantine metamorphosis was the absolute loss of the individual. In the old Roman Republic, a man's home was his fortress. In the Byzantine Labyrinth, a man's home was a data point. The bureaucracy of the Agentes grew so vast that it began to suffocate the very empire it was meant to protect. The records became more important than the reality. If the files said a province was prosperous, it was taxed until it starved, regardless of the actual harvest. The Secret Service had created a virtual empire of paper and ink, a world where the record was the only truth. They were the victims of their own perfection, a machine so complex that it eventually began to grind its own gears into dust. Yet, as the labyrinth grew more complex, it also grew more resilient. The methods of the Frumentarii, the codes, the secret signs, the use of travelers as informants, were passed down through the centuries as a sacred, dark tradition. Even as the empire faced the rise of Islam, the Crusades of the West, and the internal rot of dynastic civil war, the watching never stopped. The Agentes were the glue that held the fractured pieces of the world together. They were the eternal guardians of the status quo, the men who knew that even if the emperor fell, the empire of the record must endure. This was the bridge between the ancient world and the modern. The Byzantines took the raw military intelligence of the Frumentarii and turned it into a permanent civilian institution. They proved that a secret service is not a temporary necessity of war, but a permanent organ of a stable state. They set the blueprint for the Venetian Council of Ten, the secret police of the Tsars, and the intelligence agencies of the modern era. They were the keepers of the Black Flame, and they ensured that the light of surveillance would never go out. In the final cinematic sequence of this chapter, we see the sunset over the Golden Horn. The city is a shimmering mosaic of light and shadow. In the shadows of the Hagia Sophia, a man in a dark robe exchanges a small silver coin with a sailor from a distant land. The coin is not payment, it is a signal. The sailor whispers a name, and the man in the robe records it in a small leather-bound book. This is the work of the Agentes. This is the echo of the Frumentarii. The world has changed. The gods have changed. The language has changed, but the trade of secrets remains the same. The harvest continues, silent and eternal, in the heart of the labyrinth. The labyrinth was not just a place, it was a state of mind. It was the realization that in the game of power, the one who sees the most wins the most. The Frumentarii were the ones who first opened the eyes of the state, but the Byzantines were the ones who made sure those eyes would never close. As we move into the final chapters of this history, we see how this dark DNA was passed from the fallen walls of Constantinople to the rising powers of the West and the East, creating the world we inhabit today, a world where the labyrinth is no longer made of stone, but of light, data, and the eternal, unblinking gaze of the machine. The global echo, the death of an empire, is never the death of its ideas. When the walls of Constantinople finally crumbled and the last echoes of the Roman world faded into the silence of the past, the dark science of the Frumentarii did not vanish. It did not bleed out into the soil of history. Instead, it became a diaspora of the shadow, a ghost-like inheritance that drifted across borders, cultures, and centuries, finding new hosts in every rising power that craved the absolute control of the secret. The wheat men were gone, but their harvest had become a global industry. From the fog-shrouded canals of Venice to the frozen heart of the Russian plains, the ancient Roman DNA of surveillance was rewritten, refined, and reborn. This was the era of the global echo, where the legacy of Rome became the foundation of the modern world's secret heart. The first and most faithful inheritor of the Byzantine labyrinth was Venice, the serene republic. Venice was a city built on water, but it was anchored by the secret. The Venetian Council of Ten were the true spiritual grandsons of the Frumentarii. They did not just watch the city, they inhaled it. In Venice, the terror of the Mark returned with a cinematic nautical elegance. They placed the Bocce di Leone, the lions' mouths, across the city, stone carvings of snarling lions with slots in their mouths where any citizen could drop an anonymous accusation. This was the Roman grain tabulae, transformed into a public altar of betrayal. The Council of Ten understood, as the Frumentarii did, that the most effective way to govern a population is to make every man a spy for the state. They created a world where the water itself seemed to have ears, and where the silence of the lagoon was a heavy, suffocating weight. The Venetian Secret Service took the diplomatic terror of Rome and perfected it for the age of trade. Their ambassadors were not just diplomats. They were the most sophisticated intelligence officers the world had ever seen. They mapped the finances, the weaknesses, and the hidden desires of every king in Europe. They used codes and ciphers that made the ancient Roman wax tablets look like children's toys. But the soul of the work remained Roman, the belief that the stability of the state justifies the total erasure of the individual. Venice proved that a republic could be just as ruthless and all-seeing as an autocracy. They were the bridge that carried the shadow of Rome into the Renaissance, ensuring that as Europe moved towards the light, its government stayed firmly rooted in the dark. While Venice mastered the elegance of the secret, the North mastered its brutality. In the vast expanding territory of Russia, the spirit of the Frumentarii found a cold and terrifying new home. Ivan the Terrible, seeking to centralize power against the warring boyars, created the Oprichnina, a brotherhood of black-clad riders who were the literal reincarnation of the Roman shadow men. They rode black horses, carried the symbols of a dog's head and a broom to sniff out and sweep away treason, and operated entirely outside the law. They were the Frumentarii, stripped of their bureaucratic silk and returned to their original primal state as state-sanctioned hunters. The Oprichnina was the ancestor of the Okrana, which became the ancestor of the KGB. This was the northern metamorphosis of the Roman secret, a lineage of absolute, unblinking surveillance that turned the vastness of Russia into a closed room where no word went unheard. The cinematic evolution of the shadow continued into the age of empire and enlightenment. Every great power, Britain, France, Prussia, built its own cabinet noir, black chamber, where private letters were intercepted, opened, and copied with the same cold efficiency the agentes and Rebus had used on the Roman post. The wheat had changed. It was now the private thoughts of philosophers, the tactical plans of generals, and the secret romances of kings. But the mill remained the same. The state had decided that it owned the private lives of its citizens. The legacy of the Frumentarii had become the invisible border, the realization that a country's true strength is not measured by its soldiers, but by its secrets. As we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, the global echo has reached a frequency that is almost beyond human hearing. The Frumentarii used their eyes. We use satellites. They used wax tablets. We use encryption. They used a chalk mark on a wall. We use a digital flag in a database. But the fundamental psychological architecture has not changed by a single inch. We live in a world of total awareness, where the curiosi are no longer men in robes, but algorithms in the cloud. The state no longer needs to follow you home. It is already there, inside your pocket, watching your movements, recording your voice, and mapping your desires. The dream of the Magister Officiorum, a world where the ruler sees everything and is seen by no one, has finally been realized through the medium of light and silicon. The tragedy of this global legacy is that we have become our own Frumentarii. In the age of social media and constant connectivity, we have built our own lion's mouths. We report each other, we watch each other, and we police the boundaries of our own digital grain markets. We have internalized the surveillance of the state until the state no longer needs to exert force. We have become a civilization of couriers, moving information at the speed of light, not realizing that the pouch we carry is our own cage. The visual alphabet of fear has been replaced by the social alphabet of conformity, but the result is the same: the death of the private soul in the name of the public security. Imagine a cinematic montage spanning 2,000 years. A Frumentarius marks a door in Rome. A Venetian spy whispers in a darkened palazzo. An oprichnik gallops through a Russian forest. A modern analyst stares at a glowing screen filled with metadata. These are not different men. They are the same men wearing different masks, serving the same ancient hungry god of the state. The Frumentarii did not die. They simply became the air we breathe. They are the background noise of our civilization, the silent witness to every human endeavor. The global echo is the sound of a closing door. It is the sound of the world becoming a single, vast Castra Peregrina. We are all travelers now, moving through a landscape that is constantly being mapped, sorted, and judged. The legacy of Rome is not in its ruins, but in its rules, the invisible rules of the secret state that dictate who is a friend, who is an enemy, and who is expendable. The Frumentarii were the ones who first discovered that a state can survive without bread, but it cannot survive without the secret. And we, their inheritors, are still living in the shadow of that discovery. As we reach the final part of this cinematic history, we must ask the most difficult question of all. Is there an end to the harvest? Or is the Frumentarii's work a perpetual motion machine, a cycle of watching and being watched, that can only end when there is no one left to see? The eternal echo is not just a look at the past. It is a mirror held up to our own faces. It is the realization that the Roman Empire never truly fell. It just learned how to hide in the light. The eternal return history is not a straight line leading toward progress. It is a great circle, a wheel that grinds the bones of empires into the same dust, over and over again. As we stand at the precipice of the future, looking out into the shimmering, neon-lit horizon of the digital age, we must confront a terrifying truth. We have not escaped the shadow of the Frumentarii. We have simply perfected it. The weak men of the Caelian Hill have achieved their ultimate form, not as soldiers, not as bureaucrats, and not as spies, but as the very fabric of our reality. The harvest is no longer seasonal. It is instantaneous, constant, and absolute. This is the eternal return, the final chapter in the biography of power, where the watcher and the watched finally merge into a single seamless entity. The silent master of the future does not wear a toga or a uniform. It wears the face of everyone, everywhere, all at once. In the ancient world, the cinematic horror of the Frumentarii was their presence. The sudden shadow in the doorway, the heavy hand on the shoulder, the cold iron of the blade. In the future, the horror is their absence. The secret state no longer needs to be present because it is ambient. We have built a world where surveillance is the default state of existence. We do not fear the grain man because we have invited him into our homes, into our beds, and into our very thoughts. Every device we carry is a digital milestone, a modern millennium that records not just where we go, but how fast we move, what we desire, and who we love. The Frumentarii used to wait for a rumor to reach the palace. Today, the palace knows the rumor before it is even whispered. This is the shift from reactive control to predictive domination. The state no longer watches you for what you have done. It watches you for what you might do. The visual alphabet of fear has undergone its final evolution into the mathematical language of probability. The Frumentarii used secret signs and chalk marks to identify the damned. Today we use algorithms and social credit scores. The black circle on the villa wall has become a low-trust rating in a database, an invisible mark that can erase a person from the economy, from the social fabric, and from the historical record with a single line of code. This is the ultimate diplomatic terror, a world where you are not executed but deplatformed, shadow banned, or deleted. The machine does not need to spill blood to destroy life. It only needs to withdraw the digital silk that connects you to the rest of humanity. We have returned to the Roman concept of damnatio memoriae, the total erasure of the self, but executed with a surgical, technological precision that would have made Diocletian weep with envy. The cinematic tragedy of this final era is the death of the unknown. In the time of the Roman Empire, there were still places where the gaze of the state could not reach: the deep forests of Germania, the high peaks of the Atlas Mountains, the hidden ruins of a desert villa. There was still a wilderness of the soul, a place where a man could be alone with his gods and his secrets. But the digital labyrinth has no exit. The eyes of the empire now sit in the sky, looking down with thermal vision that sees through walls, and infrared sensors that read the heat of the human heart. There is no wilderness left. Every inch of the earth has been mapped. Every human movement has been quantified, and every secret has been converted into data. We have achieved the total awareness the Byzantines dreamed of, but at the cost of the very thing that makes us human, our mystery. The Frumentarii were the first to understand that information is a form of gravity. It pulls everything toward the center. In the future, this gravity has become so strong that it has created a singularity of surveillance. The state, the corporation, and the individual have collapsed into a single vibrating web of observation. We are the grain being harvested, but we are also the mill that grinds it. We provide the data, we build the sensors, and we police our peers with a relentless social curiosity that makes the ancient curiosi look like amateurs. We have internalized the shadow language so deeply that we no longer need a master to tell us what to fear. We fear the outlier within ourselves. We have become a civilization that is afraid of its own shadow because we know that the shadow is being recorded. Imagine the final cinematic shot of this entire journey, a wide panoramic view of a modern metropolis at night. The city is a sea of glittering lights, a beautiful, glowing circuit board. As the camera zooms in, we see the individual humans, billions of tiny, pulsing lights. Each light is connected to 1,000 invisible threads, a web of signals that pulses with a rhythmic, cold intelligence. This is the modern Castra Peregrina. This is the world the Frumentarii built. The camera continues to zoom in until it focuses on a single person staring into the glowing screen of a phone. The light of the screen reflects in their eyes, and for a split second, we see the ghostly image of a Roman soldier in a dusty tunic, standing right behind them, looking over their shoulder. The soldier isn't holding a dagger, he's just watching. And then he smiles. The legacy of the Frumentarii is the realization that power is not about the sword. Power is about the sight. He who sees the most rules the most. The Roman Empire did not fall because its walls were breached. It fell because its eyes grew tired. But the machine we have built to replace those eyes never sleeps. It does not age, it does not hunger, and it does not forgive. It is the silent master that will govern the future. A god made of our own secrets, a mirror that only reflects the parts of us that the state finds useful. The harvest is eternal, and the wheat is us. This is the end of the history of the Frumentarii, but it is not the end of their story. Their story continues in every terms and conditions you accept without reading. It continues in every camera that tracks your face in a crowded square. It continues in every smart device that listens for its name. The grain men are still here. They have just learned to move through the wires instead of the streets. They have traded their leather pouches for data centers and their daggers for algorithms. But the purpose remains the same: to ensure that the labyrinth has no end, and that the emperor, whoever or whatever he may be, never has to look away. As the screen fades to black, the only sound left is the soft rhythmic scratching of a stylus across a parchment, a sound that transforms into the clicking of a keyboard, and finally into the silent, high-frequency hum of a server farm. The shadow has won. The Roman world has finally achieved its ultimate goal, a silence so perfect that it sounds like peace. A peace where everyone is watched and no one is free. The eternal return is complete. The future is a past that hasn't happened yet, and the past is a future that we are still living through. Welcome to the Empire. The harvest is ready.